The Wars of Scottish Independence, a series of military campaigns fought between Scotland and England in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, largely defining the course of Scottish history. The conflict began in 1296, when Edward I of England invaded Scotland, intent on asserting his authority over the nation, sparking a widespread rebellion. It led to the emergence of iconic Scottish figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Wallace's victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge and the subsequent defeat at the Battle of Falkirk highlighted the fierce contest. But it was Robert the Bruce's ascendancy and his decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314 that ultimately turned the tide in favour of Scotland. The battle saw a much smaller Scottish force defeat a much larger and better equipped English army. Thus the conflict continued intermittently until 1328, when the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton recognised Scotland's independence, with Robert the Bruce finally acknowledged as king. Hello everyone and welcome. If you're new to the channel, it's great to meet you. And if you're coming back, as always, pleasure to have you back here with me. Now, if you'd like to support the channel, you're already doing so by just enjoying yourself being on here. That's all I need, but a like and subscribe certainly helps grease the wheels. If you want to go even further than that, well, then you can take a look at the video description. Now, without further ado, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can continue with the topic for today, and that topic is the Wars of Scottish Independence. Well, let's start back to the seeds of the conflict. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland passed away, leaving his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as his sole heir. At the time, she was just 3 years old, and her ascension prompted plans for a strategic marriage to Edward of Carnarvon, the son of Edward I of England, formalized by the Treaty of Berwick in 1290. This treaty emphasized maintaining Scottish sovereignty despite the marriage, and it stipulated that Scotland must remain a separate kingdom with its own laws and its own liberties. But tragically, Margaret died in the Orkney Islands in September of 1290 while en route to Scotland, precipitating a succession crisis with 13 contenders, each with different claims for the throne. Now, the primary claimants were Robert de Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, the Lord of Galloway. The potential for civil war led the Guardians of Scotland to seek arbitration from Edward I, who agreed to intervene on the condition of being recognized as Lord Paramount of Scotland, a status that effectively granted him supreme authority over the kingdom. Edward's insistence on being acknowledged as Lord Paramount was of course strategic, leveraging his military presence and the claimant's vested interests in England, many of whom, including ecclesiastical figures like Bishop Wishart, owned extensive lands there in the north. His ultimatum effectively coerced the Scottish claimants and nobles into compliance, as if they had much of a choice anyway. And thus we find ourselves in June of 1291, where Edward I takes a decisive role in Scottish affairs. He commanded that all Scottish castles be placed under his command, and all officials resign, only to be reappointed under his command. This move consolidated his power, culminating in a gathering at Upsetlington, where Scottish nobles and guardians were compelled to bend the knee and swear fealty to him. This allegiance had to be affirmed by all Scots by the 27th of July, 1291, further solidifying Edward's iron grip over the north. Thus, from May to August of 1291, the dispute over the Scottish crown, known as the Great Cause, was deliberated in 13 meetings held at Berwick. The claimants presented their cases before King Edward I of England, who presided as the Lord Paramount, and ultimately the competition narrowed to 4 claimants with direct descent from David I. Those claimants were John Balliol, Robert de Bruce, Floris V of Holland, and John of Hastings. On August 3rd, 1291, Edward directed Balliol and Bruce to appoint 40 arbiters each, while he himself chose 24 to decide the case. Edward's insistence on controlling the arbitration process was evident when he signed a writ on August 12th to collect all documents related to the competitors' claims and his own claim to overlordship. By November, John Balliol was selected as king by a majority of the arbiters, and was crowned on November 30th, 1292, at Scone Abbey. Following his coronation, Balliol's reign quickly became compromised by his allegiance to Edward I. On December 26th, he swore homage to Edward at Newcastle upon Tyne, acknowledging Scotland as a vassal state to England. This act of fealty was understandably deeply and widely unpopular in Scotland, and just added to the pile of national unrest. We're talking deep-seated animosities between these two lands. Well, Edward's demands, as if they weren't enough already, escalated in 1294, when he summoned Balliol to provide Scottish troops and funds for his war in France. After consolidating his council, Balliol decided to resist Edward's demands. Enough was enough. And in late 1294, a Scottish parliament formed a war council and initiated diplomatic efforts to secure alliances against England. In a strategic move, emissaries were sent to France to negotiate what would become known as the Old Alliance. This treaty, established with King Philip IV of France, promised mutual support between Scotland and France against England. The alliance was sealed by the proposed marriage of Balliol's son Edward to Philip's niece Joan. Additionally, a treaty with Norway was negotiated, promising naval support, but it never materialized. There was simply no way they were going to help them. Now, Edward I only became aware of these alliances in 1295, and quickly began to fortify England's northern defences. Amidst these tensions, he appointed Robert Bruce, the 6th Lord of Annandale, as the governor of Carlisle Castle, and demanded that Balliol hand over strategic Scottish fortresses, once again escalating the conflict. In response, Balliol summoned Scottish forces to assemble at Caddon-Lee by March 11th, 1296. Well, not all Scottish nobles heeded the call, notably Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, abstained due to previous grievances with Balliol over land disputes. Well, the First War of Scottish Independence is typically segmented into the four main stages. The initial victorious English invasion in 1296, a period of resistance led by William Wallace and Andrew de Moray, which spanned from 1297 until a peace deal in 1304, brokered by John Comyn. The resurgence of conflict under Robert the Bruce, starting with his dramatic act in 1306 and culminating at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and finally the subsequent military and diplomatic actions by Scotland until the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed in 1328. And thus we find ourselves right there in 1296, where the conflict ignited with Edward I's devastating attack on Berwick, continued with the Scottish loss at the Battle of Dunbar, and the abdication of John Balliol by July. By August, following the removal of the Stone of Destiny to Westminster Abbey, Edward had coerced Scottish nobles into recognizing him as king at a parliament in Berwick, effectively bringing Scotland under control. Rebellions flared up in 1297, led by figures like Wallace and Moray. Although initial resistance was quelled at Irvine, their ongoing efforts led to a pivotal Scottish triumph at Stirling Bridge, though Moray died from wounds sustained in battle. Well, despite subsequent Scottish raids into England and William Wallace's appointment as Guardian of Scotland, Edward's retaliatory campaigns in 1298 culminated in a tactical, yet costly victory at Falkirk. Post-Falkirk, Wallace is rumoured to have supported the French against England, while diplomatic efforts to free the imprisoned Scottish King John took him to the papal court in Rome. Governance of Scotland was then assumed by Robert Bruce and John Comyn, along with William de Lamberton, appointed as a mediator in 1299. This period saw the freeing of King John due to international pressures, and Wallace's mission to seek support from the French. Edward's campaigns in 1300 and 1301 led to a temporary peace in 1302, but hostilities resumed, leading to the fall of Stirling Castle in 1304. Negotiations in early 1304 resulted in most Scottish nobles swearing fealty to England, seemingly quelling the Scottish resistance. Seemingly, at least. However, the execution of William Wallace in 1305 did appear to mark the end of significant opposition. But internal agreements among Scottish leaders, particularly between Bruce and Lamberton, hinted at continued efforts to restore Scottish independence, despite the complexities of their political affiliations and the broad acceptance, albeit somewhat dissatisfied acceptance, of English rule. On the 10th of February, 1306, a significant altercation occurred between Robert Bruce and John Comyn, the remaining contenders for the Scottish crown, at Greyfriars Kirk at Dumfries. Now, Bruce killed Comyn during the meeting, which reignited the Scottish rebellion. It is alleged that Comyn had breached a mutual pact to support each other's claims to the throne, Bruce aspiring to be king, and Comyn in exchange for his backing to receive lands. However, Comyn purportedly aimed to secure both the throne and the lands by betraying Bruce to the English king. Bruce did not like that. Can't blame him for being a little upset. Thus he intercepted a message from Comyn to King Edward which confirmed the betrayal. In writing, he'd caught Comyn red-handed, and it prompted him to kill him and rally support from other Scottish leaders. Within weeks of the murder, Bruce was crowned King of Scots, launching a new phase in his campaign for Scottish independence. Now, despite an initial setback at the Battle of Methven, which forced Bruce into hiding and led to the capture of his family by English forces, he resumed his campaign in 1307, following the death of Edward I. His forces gradually regained strength and territory, achieving significant victories at Loudon Hill and through the strategic captures of Roxburgh and Edinburgh castles. The pivotal Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Bruce's army delivered a decisive blow to the English, marked the turning point, leading to the eventual return of Bruce's family from captivity. In the political aftermath, Bruce focused on solidifying Scotland's independence. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, endorsed by Scottish nobles, clergy, and King Robert himself, was sent to the Pope asserting Scotland's sovereignty. Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, further reinforced this position in 1324 by securing Pope John's recognition of Robert as the legitimate King of Scots during a visit to Avignon. But of course, things changed again in England with the deposition and subsequent murder of Edward II in 1327, bringing Edward III to the throne. Continued Scottish incursions in northern England culminated in the Battle of Stanhope Park, nearly capturing the young English king. These pressures compelled Edward III to agree to the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, which acknowledged Scottish independence and Robert's kingship, thereby formally ending the First War of Scottish Independence. Of course, the treaty also facilitated the marriage of Robert's son David to Edward III's sister, further sealing the peace between Scotland and England. And they lived happily ever after. No, I'm just joking. And now the Second War of Scottish Independence. Of course, the first one was so good they had to have a sequel. Now in 1331, Edward Balliol, alongside Henry Beaumont, the Earl of Buchan, and other dispossessed Scottish nobles, convened in Yorkshire to orchestrate an invasion of Scotland. While Edward III of England outwardly forbade this plan, his actions suggested more tacit approval, as he only prohibited an overland invasion, allowing Balliol's forces to depart from Yorkshire ports by sea on July 31st, 1332. Meanwhile, Scotland, under the regency of Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, braced for the incoming invasion. However, Moray passed away just 10 days before Balliol's departure and missed the entire party. Well, Balliol landed in Fife on August the 6th, 1332, with approximately 2,000 predominantly English troops. Shortly after landing, he engaged and overcame local Scottish forces at the Battle of Kinghorn. On August 11th, Balliol faced a significantly larger Scottish army, estimated between 15 and 40,000, led by the new Guardian of Scotland, Donald, the Earl of Mar, near Perth. Utilizing the cover of night, Balliol's forces crossed the River Erne at an unguarded ford and established a strong defensive position. During the ensuing Battle of Duplin Moor, the Scottish forces hastened their attack, became disorganized, and were ultimately trapped in a valley. And immediately in come the English longbowmen to exploit this by firing into the compressed Scottish ranks, causing severe casualties through suffocation, trampling, and of course the hundreds of arrows. The battle concluded with a devastating defeat for the Scots, leading to significant noble losses, including Earl Mar and the capture of Perth by Balliol's forces. This conflict marked the onset of the Second War of Scottish Independence. Balliol was crowned King of Scotland at Scone on the 24th of September 1332. Almost immediately, he secured his allegiance to Edward III by ceding significant Scottish lands, including Berwick, totaling around £2,000 in value. However, Balliol's reign faced continuous challenges due to his limited support within Scotland and ongoing military threats. By the 7th of October, David II's supporters had retaken Perth and completely demolished its fortifications. The situation worsened for Balliol when, on December the 16th, he was defeated and nearly captured by David II's forces at the Battle of Annan, forcing him to flee to England in a very dishevelled state, and feeling quite sorry for himself, I'm sure. Seeking refuge and support, Balliol appealed to Edward III, who then abandoned his neutral stance, formally recognized Balliol as the King of Scotland, and prepared for open warfare, signalling a more direct English involvement in Scottish affairs. Although there wasn't widespread enthusiasm among the English for resuming war with Scotland, Edward III supported Edward Balliol. In reaction, the Scots executed minor raids into Cumberland, which were for the most part ineffective. Edward III justified his subsequent invasion of Scotland as a response to these raids. He specifically targeted Berwick, strategically located on the Anglo-Scottish border, vital as a major trade route. Berwick, described by a contemporary chronicler as a bustling hub akin to Alexandria, let's not go crazy, was Scotland's premier trading town, notably profitable from wool duties, representing the Scottish Crown's primary income source. While the potential loss of Berwick, that was something Edward had hoped would force the Scots into the direct battle that he wanted, and that was a scenario that he was confident of winning. Historically, direct confrontations were rare, and the Scots had always favored guerrilla tactics and ambushes. According to some historians, the significance of Berwick was such that its abandonment by the Scots was nearly inconceivable. It would be like the Romans abandoning Rome, or indeed the Egyptians abandoning Cairo in our modern day. Think about it like that. The siege began in late March 1333, with Edward joining the main English forces on May the 9th. Despite Berwick's strong defense and ample supplies, the English siege only intensified, devastating the town by late June and pushing the garrison towards complete collapse. A truce on July 15th stipulated that the Scots would surrender by sunset on the 19th of July if no relief force came. Meanwhile, the Scottish army led by Sir Archibald Douglas had entered England, wreaking havoc in the northeast, a situation that Edward simply chose to ignore. There were far more important things to deal with. Douglas, at this time, saw no alternative but to confront the English forces directly. Thus, Sir Archibald Douglas led the Scottish forces in an assault aimed at engaging the English army stationed at Halidon Hill. The Scots faced a challenging advance downhill, and then had to cross a significant expanse of marshland before ascending the northern slopes of the hill. The English archers inflicted severe casualties on the advancing Scots. As described in the Lanercost Chronicle, the Scots at the front were so heavily wounded and blinded from a barrage of arrows that they could barely defend themselves, ultimately turning away from the onslaught. Despite the heavy losses at the lower slopes, the remaining Scottish forces continued their uphill charge through the dense arrow volley, described vividly as thick as motes in a sunbeam by a contemporary source. They then encountered English spearmen positioned strategically to meet them head-on. The Scottish ranks broke under this intense pressure. It was all too much. Chaos ensued as camp followers fled, taking horses and anything they could carry with them, and the battlefield was left strewn with the screaming and moaning dead and dying. Not very pretty of a sight. And thus the defeat was catastrophic for the Scots, with casualties in the thousands, including Douglas himself and 5 other earls. Following the battle, English knights pursued the fleeing Scots, exacerbating the slaughter. And the Scots who surrendered, well, they suffered a grim fate too, executed on Edward's orders, and others drowned while attempting to escape into the sea. Reports on English casualties were minimal, varying from as few as 7 to 14. Now that is a big disparity. Now the aftermath on the 20th of July, the day the truce for Berwick's surrender expired, saw around 100 captured Scots lose their heads, marking a brutal conclusion to the conflict. Berwick subsequently surrendered to the English, sealing a decisive victory for Edward III. 1 point to the English. Now, in May 1334, David II of Scotland sought refuge in France, accepting an invitation from King Philip VI amidst the turbulence of Scotland at the time. It was not a good place to be. Thus, on the 19th of June of the same year, 1334, Edward Balliol formally pledged allegiance to Edward III and ceded 8 southeastern counties of Scotland to complete English control. Ruling from Perth, Balliol tried to suppress ongoing resistance against his authority. Despite controlling the majority of Scotland, with David's supporters only holding 5 fortresses, and not very good ones at that. Internal conflicts among Balliol's allies weakened their position even further. These internal divisions not only made Balliol's supporters vulnerable to attacks and defections, but also spurred on the loyalists to Robert the Bruce. The persistent strife and the lack of a unified front among Balliol's allies facilitated the re-emergence of support for David's cause. The French, concerned about English expansion into Scotland, provided covert financial and possibly military support to Bruce's loyalists, though the exact timing and manner of this support remains unclear. Facing increasing opposition and defection within his ranks, Balliol withdrew to Berwick. During the winter of 1334–35, both Edward III and Balliol conducted destructive raids from Roxburgh across the western lowlands, targeting the properties of both their adversaries and erstwhile allies. Yet they encountered no significant Scottish military resistance. Amid these military failures and the shifting loyalties of his allies, Balliol found his position increasingly untenable. The leading pro-Bruce nobles, capitalizing on Balliol's weakened state and the divided loyalties among his camp, formally reached out to King Philip of France, seeking direct military support to reinforce their cause against Balliol and his English backers. Since the Norman conquest in 1066, English monarchs had possessed territories in France, making them vassals to French kings, a situation that frequently led to conflict. And by 1334, the English retained only Gascony in southwestern France and Ponthieu in the north. Gascony, in particular, was crucial for Edward, as it was a significant source of income due to the duties on wine, which constituted the largest single revenue stream for the English crown. And now for that long-standing, old alliance between France and Scotland, first established in 1299 and renewed in 1326, was a mutual defence pact designed to curb English ambitions by threatening reciprocal invasions if, should England attack either ally. And by 1331, after prolonged and tense discussions, Edward III and Philip VI of France had resolved most of their disputes in a formal treaty, paving the way for Philip to plan a crusade to the Holy Land, for which he sought English support, or at least neutrality. While in early 1335, Philip VI dispatched an ambassador to England to confront Edward about his aggressive policies towards Scotland. The meeting occurred in Newcastle on the 18th of February, where Edward gave evasive responses, but did allow the French ambassador to try to broker a peace. A temporary truce was thus established, set to last until the middle of 1335. However, disunity among the Scottish nobility prevented them from forming a cohesive strategy for peace talks, while Edward used this period to stabilize his finances and prepare his military forces for further actions. In the spring of 1335, Edward III assembled a formidable army of over 13,000 men on the Scottish border, the largest he had ever mobilized against Scotland, timing his campaign to coincide with the expiry of a truce. Anticipating this, Bruce loyalists also prepared, setting aside internal conflicts and vacating the central lowlands to brace for the invasion. In July, Edward led a portion of his force from Carlisle towards Glasgow, meeting the rest of his troops who had marched from Berwick under Edward Balliol by the month's end. The English forces, adhering to a scorched earth strategy and encountering very little resistance, devastated the lands from which they passed through and eventually occupied Perth, the Scottish capital, continuing their widespread looting and destruction to draw the Scots out into an open-pitched battle. Meanwhile, the French, frustrated with the ongoing conflict, gathered a force of 6,000 to support David II and restore him to the Scottish throne. This force was part of a broader French strategy that included naval attacks on English ships from French ports and raids along the English southern coast. King Philip VI of France proposed that Edward submit the competing claims to the Scottish throne to Pope Benedict XII for arbitration to avoid another Anglo-French war. But Edward declined. In Scotland, a truce was negotiated between Edward and the Scots, lasting from mid-October 1335 until the 3rd of May 1336, although this truce did not apply to Balliol's forces, allowing the Bruce faction to focus on his supporters. On the 30th of November, Sir Andrew Murray, leading 1,100 Bruce loyalists, decisively defeated a larger pro-Balliol force at the Battle of Culblean, killing its commander, David Strathbogie, marking a significant boost to Scottish morale and reducing Balliol to dependence on English military support. The Pope finally persuaded Philip to delay military action against England to preserve the possibility of a crusade. However, by March 1336, Philip convinced David II to reject a peace treaty that Murray, now regent and guardian of Scotland, was willing to accept, committing France to restore David to the throne. The French then got busy amassing a fleet of over 500 ships in Normandy, planning to land one army in Scotland and another at Portsmouth, while Edward focused on financing the Scottish campaign and fortifying the English southern coast. His forces continued aggressive sorties into Scotland. Now the Scots largely avoided direct engagement, resorting once again to a scorched earth policy, including the razing of Perth. As news of the planned French invasion reached them, Edward quickly moved north, joining Balliol in Perth on the 28th of June. The non-arrival of the French forces saw Edward leading a force of 800 men in mid-July to relieve the siege of Lochindaub and wreak havoc along the Scottish east coast from the Firth of Tay to the Moray Firth, targeting potential French landing sites like Forres and Aberdeen. Throughout, Murray adeptly avoided open battle against the superior English forces. During the summer of 1336, an English ambassador sought negotiations with Philip and David. On the 20th of August, Philip rejected the English proposals and fully committed to military support for David's faction, leading the French privateers to intensify attacks on English shipping and ports, sparking panic along the English southern coast. Edward III, upon learning of these developments in mid-September, returned to England. Arriving too late to confront the French ships directly, he implemented new war taxes and planned to spend the winter in Scotland, in a fortress on the Clyde. Meanwhile, the Scots, led by Sir Andrew Murray, engaged in guerrilla tactics against the English and destroyed Dunatar, Kinneff, and Lauriston castles to deny them to Edward. All the while, famine and disease spread across all of Scotland. The political and legal pressure from France began to intensify, and by 1337, Philip was preparing to invade Gascony. Edward returned to England in December of 1336 to prepare for the impending conflict with France. In early 1337, with Edward distracted by French threats, Bruce loyalists under Murray and Sir William Douglas launched invasions into Fife. The local English commanders struggled to respond effectively, leading to the Scottish overrun of the north. In April, another Scottish army ravaged Balliol-controlled Galloway. On May 24, 1337, Philip's Great Council decreed that Gascony and Ponthieu should revert to French control, citing Edward's failure as a vassal, marking the onset of the 100 Years' War. Throughout that year, the Scots continued their incursions into the lowlands, besieging Edinburgh Castle and devastating Cumberland, including an attack on Carlisle. Edward sent additional forces to Scotland, but with limited impact. In 1338, Edward balanced defending the English coast and assembling a continental army while still dispatching forces to Scotland. French support bolstered the Scots, who managed to recapture Perth in 1339 with French aid. By 1340, English control in Scotland was confined to a few fortresses like Stirling, all under siege or reliant on supplies by sea. By 1341, active combat with England had more or less diminished, but internal feuds divided the Scottish nobility. David II returned to Scotland on June 2, 1341, with his wife Joan, and struggled to assert his authority, exacerbating tensions. Despite these challenges, the Scots gradually repelled the English, with Stirling and Roxburgh Castle falling in 1342. David II's reign saw continuous conflicts, both internal and with England. He faced significant resistance from the Scottish nobility, exemplified when Douglas imprisoned and starved Alexander Ramsay to death over a dispute concerning the constableship of Roxburgh. By 1345, David had secured some control over the nobility, continuing raids into England and consolidating his authority within Scotland. In July 1346, Edward III of England launched an invasion into Normandy with a formidable force of 15,000 troops, prompting Philip VI of France to call David II of Scotland to honor their alliance and invade England. Philip betrayed northern England as virtually undefended due to English military commitments elsewhere in Gascony, Brittany, and Flanders, urging David to act swiftly and assertively. Initially, Scottish probes into northern England were met with strong resistance from local defenders. Nevertheless, David arranged a truce to last until September 29th, giving him time to fully mobilize the Scots. On October 7th, the Scots launched a full-scale invasion into England with about 12,000 men, including modern French-supplied weapons and armor, making it one of the most formidable Scottish forces in years, not just in numbers, but also in equipment. A contingent of French knights accompanied them. Anticipating such an invasion, the English had strategically exempted the northern counties from contributing troops to the Normandy campaign. Responding rapidly to the Scottish advance, the English, led by William de la Zoche, Archbishop of York and Lord Warden of the Marches, and Ralph Neville, assembled an army of 6,000 to 7,000 men near Durham. And thus the two armies met on October 17th. The battle began with a standoff that lasted until the afternoon, when English longbowmen were sent forth to skirmish, disrupting the Scottish lines. The Earl of Menthia's cavalry charge failed to dislodge the archers, who then goaded the main Scottish force into a premature and disorganized attack. Hindered by the terrain and relentless arrow volleys, the 1st Scottish Division was quickly overwhelmed. The subsequent Scottish units, including the largest division under the Earl of March and Robert Stewart, collapsed under pressure and fled the field. The English troops held their position and continued to rain down arrows on the remaining Scots, including those under the command of David II. When the English men-at-arms finally engaged, they fought with intense vigor and forced the Scots into a chaotic retreat. David II was severely wounded and captured during the retreat, and the English pursued the remnants of the Scottish army throughout the night. The battle resulted in significant Scottish losses, with over 50 barons killed or captured, effectively decimating Scotland's military leadership and marking a devastating defeat for Scotland in the broader context of Anglo-Scottish conflicts. Following the capture of David at Neville's Cross, Edward Balliol, having participated in the battle, sought to capitalize on the English victory by rallying forces for another campaign into Scotland. Despite regaining allegiance in some southern communities, Balliol's efforts were largely ineffectual. In Scotland, amidst the power vacuum and with their king thrown in prison, the Scots appointed David's nephew, Robert Stewart, as Lord Guardian and Regent. Stewart, the future Robert II, was more focused on consolidating his own position than managing the kingdom's broader concerns. His authority was undermined by his previous abandonment of David at Neville's Cross, which cast doubt on his loyalty. Edward III used the imprisoned Scottish king as leverage in negotiations, proposing in 1348 that David hold Scotland as a feudal land from England and potentially name Edward or one of his sons as his heir. By 1350, Edward adjusted his terms, offering to ransom David for £40,000, alongside reinstating Balliol's Scottish allies with his young son John of Gaunt to be named David's successor, if he died childless. These terms, however, were rejected by the Scottish Parliament, especially by Stewart, who viewed them as a threat to his own succession. Well, as the Anglo-French War consumed Edward's attention, he revisited negotiations in 1354, simplifying his demand to just a ransom, which Scotland again declined due to the potential implications for future English dominance. In 1355, tensions along the Anglo-Scottish border surged, leading to military build-up and a brief truce that the Scots, spurred by the French support, broke by raiding Northumberland and seizing Berwick on Tweed. Now Edward's forces, redirected from France, recaptured Berwick and pushed into southern Scotland in early 1356, leaving widespread devastation. Balliol formally relinquished his claim to the Scottish throne in January, accepting a pension from Edward. The English army advanced to Edinburgh, burning it and other locales, and planned to march on Perth. However, that famous Scottish weather hampered their logistics, forcing a withdrawal under heavy Scottish harassment. The campaign ended with the disbandment of the English army in Carlisle, and the Scots recapturing 2 English-held castles. A new truce was established in April, halting hostilities, momentarily. The catastrophic defeat of the French at the Battle of Poitiers in September 1356, where around 6,000 of their 14,000 to 16,000 troops were killed or captured, including the French king, severely impacted Scottish aspirations. The defeat diminished hopes of achieving Scottish war aims through a French negotiated general treaty, and raised the likelihood that English forces could indeed be redeployed to Scotland. Facing the dwindling prospect of further military or financial support from France, the Scots negotiated a ransom of about 100,000 marks for the release of David II, to be paid over 10 years in annual installments, each St. John the Baptist Day, under the terms of the Treaty of Berwick. To ensure compliance, 23 Scottish nobles were held hostage by the English. The treaty also stipulated that Scottish citizens were prohibited from bearing arms against Edward III or his forces until full payment of the ransom. And the English, well, they were to cease their military operations against Scotland. And thus the Treaty of Berwick essentially marked the end of the Second Scottish War of Independence. While Edward III didn't really achieve much, Scotland did maintain its independence. However, the treaty, being more of a truce than a peace agreement, did not completely halt hostilities, which of course persisted intermittently over the next 4 decades. Major conflicts resumed in 1400 when Henry IV of England invaded Lothian. Now, as for David, upon his return to Scotland, he faced the daunting task of managing internal noble rivalries. Accusations against him of adopting an overly luxurious and costly lifestyle led to a rebellion in 1360, which he successfully suppressed, securing his position on the throne. His wife, Joan, chose not to return to Scotland with him, taking issue with the English mistress he had taken during his 11 years of captivity. Well, you can't blame her for taking issue with that. Although the ransom treaty placed a significant financial burden on Scotland, it was less damaging than the ongoing raids by the English. David ceased payments, however, after only 20,000 marks had been paid, leading to renegotiations that ultimately reduced the debt. And with that, we reach the end of our videos on the First and Second War of Scottish Independence. I'd like to thank my top patrons and supporters: Scott, Aaron, James, Tim, Wendy, Jeffrey, JC, Star Factory, and Charles. And I'd like to thank you for listening all of this way. I know the videos are very long. I know it's very easy to fall asleep. If you want to fall asleep, go ahead and do it. As I say at the start of all these videos, enjoy it at your own pace, in your own time. I will see you in the next exciting installment. You know exactly where I'll be, right here on YouTube, whenever you want to pay me a visit. Good night. Lots of love to you all. I mean it. See you later.